August 5th, 1944. Camp Swift, Texas. The desert sun baked the dust into a crust of gold, and the smell of roasted beef drifted across the wind. A line of tired German prisoners, sunburned, silent, their grey uniforms faded to the colour of clay, were marched toward a mess hall that looked nothing like the propaganda leaflets they'd once seen back home. No snarling guards, no whips, no starvation, just the scent of steak and tobacco. Obergefreiter Karl Müller couldn't believe it. Just 3 weeks earlier, he'd been pulled from the ruins of Saint-Lô, covered in soot and shame, and shipped across the Atlantic in the hold of a Liberty ship. Now, as he stepped through the wooden doors of an American prison camp, he saw soldiers, his enemies, serving plates of food big enough to feed a squad, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread, and meat, actual meat. The guards stood casually, their rifles slung low. One of them grinned and said, "Take your time, fellas. There's enough for everyone." Müller froze. This wasn't war. This was something he couldn't name. He sat down with trembling hands, staring at the plate before him. In Germany, civilians were already rationing turnip soup. His younger brother had written once that he'd traded a pack of cigarettes for a loaf of bread. Yet here, the enemy's prisoners were eating better than their own army. As the first bite of steak hit his tongue, Müller whispered under his breath, "Das kann nicht wahr sein." This can't be real. And in that single moment, the myth began to crack, the myth that America was a nation of monsters. Back in Germany, Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda had long painted a different picture. The Allies, he warned, were barbaric, Anglo-American devils who tortured prisoners, burned cities, and enslaved anyone they captured. Posters showed grotesque caricatures of American soldiers grinning over piles of bones, while radio broadcasts swore that surrender meant certain death. Many of the men who now stood in Camp Swift's dusty courtyard had believed it. Some had even fought harder because of it, preferring death to capture. But the reality of America was not the fire and steel they'd been promised. It was routine, discipline, and something deeply disarming: fairness. By 1944, the United States held nearly 425,000 German prisoners of war in more than 500 camps scattered across the country. They were housed according to the strict guidelines of the Geneva Convention of 1929, which required humane treatment, adequate food, medical care, and the right to communicate with family through the Red Cross. For many Americans, these POWs were out of sight, tucked behind barbed wire in rural towns. But for the prisoners themselves, America was a revelation. They were allowed to play soccer, organize orchestras, and even publish camp newspapers. The U.S. military discovered that giving men dignity was a more powerful weapon than cruelty. At Camp Swift, Müller watched as a group of fellow prisoners played cards under a tree. Cigarettes passed between them. Lucky strikes, fresh from Red Cross parcels. It was almost absurd. In Europe, he'd seen men die over a single pack. In his notebook, he wrote a quiet confession. "We were told America was soulless, but here even prisoners are treated as men." The war still raged overseas, but in these small corners of America, something else was happening. A quiet dismantling of Nazi ideology, not by bullets, but by kindness. Every morning at Camp Swift began the same way: reveille at 6 a.m., breakfast at 6:30. The clang of the mess hall bell echoed across the compound as the German prisoners lined up in orderly rows, boots dusty, faces freshly shaven. The meals were predictable but plentiful: oatmeal, eggs, bacon, and coffee, strong enough to cut through the Texas heat. For men who had survived on black bread and ersatz coffee made from roasted barley, it was a feast. The prisoners worked too, but under surprising conditions. Under U.S. Army supervision, they were sent out to nearby farms, sawmills, and construction sites, earning 80 cents a day in canteen coupons they could trade for chocolate, soap, or even writing paper. Some Americans at first bristled. Why feed the enemy steak and cigarettes when their own boys were fighting overseas? But farmers soon changed their tune. With millions of Americans drafted, POW labor kept the crops alive. At one camp in Georgia, a farmer named Harold Jenkins recalled years later, "They worked like any hired hands. We talked, shared lunch, sometimes even sang. They were just boys, like ours." Inside the wire, the German prisoners formed their own communities. Barracks were decorated with hand-painted murals, some patriotic, some nostalgic. Choirs rehearsed on Sundays, and professors among them began teaching classes in mathematics and literature. The guards, mostly young Americans barely older than the prisoners, often watched with curiosity rather than suspicion. Occasionally, tension flared, especially among die-hard Nazis who tried to enforce loyalty within the camp. But for most, daily life was governed not by fear, but by routine. The Americans ensured that Geneva Convention rules were followed almost to the letter. Even small privileges, like a library with German language books, reminded the men that the world outside Nazi propaganda was not what they had been told. Karl Müller spent his evenings sitting by the fence, watching the sun dip low over the Texas plains. Beyond the wire, he could see American guards smoking, laughing, listening to a radio that played Glenn Miller's "In the Mood." Sometimes the guards would toss the prisoners a newspaper or a fresh pack of Camels. It was strange, Müller thought. In this war, kindness was more unsettling than cruelty. By the winter of 1944, the psychological shift was impossible to ignore. German officers began to notice that their men, the same soldiers once steeped in Nazi discipline, were questioning everything they had believed about the Reich. The barbed wire no longer symbolized humiliation. For many, it had become a strange form of liberation. The U.S. War Department knew this was no accident. The Office of War Information had encouraged the humane treatment of prisoners, not only as a matter of law, but as a deliberate psychological weapon. Every steak served, every cigarette shared, every letter delivered by the Red Cross chipped away at the myth of Nazi superiority. In Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, an interpreter named Captain Henry Kolb, fluent in German, noticed how the prisoners' attitudes evolved. "At first," he wrote in his diary, "they marched like machines, rigid, cold, eyes straight ahead. By spring they were whistling American tunes." One afternoon, a shipment of Red Cross parcels arrived, each containing a small miracle: tinned meat, cheese, chocolate, and 10 cigarettes. Müller helped distribute them. The men handled the goods with quiet reverence, symbols of a system that even in war valued fairness. A few hardliners still clung to Hitler's promises. They whispered that all of this was a trick, that the Americans were softening them before extermination, but the evidence of daily life said otherwise. Guards joked with them. Local church groups sent Christmas cards. A chaplain even organized a carol service for both POWs and U.S. personnel. That Christmas night, under paper lanterns strung between the barracks, Müller stood among hundreds of German prisoners singing Stille Nacht. On the other side of the fence, the guards joined in, their English voices blending softly into the Texas dark. For a moment, war dissolved into music, and when the last note faded, Müller realized something that terrified him more than captivity. He was beginning to admire his captors. That was the turning point. Not a battle won with guns, but with decency. As 1945 dawned, the end of the war loomed, though few yet dared to believe it. Rumors seeped into the camps through new arrivals, bombed out cities, German soldiers surrendering by the thousands, Allied troops marching toward Berlin. For men like Karl Müller, those whispers carried both relief and guilt. Relief that it might finally be over. Guilt that he would return to a homeland that no longer resembled the one he'd fought for. By then, life in the camp had settled into a rhythm so familiar that the outside world felt distant. The prisoners' own officers no longer tried to enforce loyalty. The swastikas painted on barrack walls were quietly scrubbed away, replaced by crude sketches of home, church spires, forests, and children playing in snow. The men who once quoted Hitler now traded English words with their guards. Howdy, coffee, good night. The Americans noticed. Lieutenant James Porter, who oversaw daily operations at Camp Swift, later told a reporter, "They came in as soldiers of Hitler. They left as men who'd seen something better." Many POWs began volunteering for educational programs set up by the US Army, lessons in democracy, civics, and ethics. Some learned that their own government had executed Allied prisoners or starved Soviet captives. The contrast was impossible to ignore. When the war finally ended in May 1945, celebrations erupted across the camp. The Americans played Boogie Woogie Bugle Boy over the loudspeakers. Some of the Germans cheered quietly, others wept. Müller sat on his bunk and wrote his final diary entry. "I am not proud of what we fought for, but I am proud that I learned here, among my enemies, that humanity still exists." Months later, transport ships began ferrying the prisoners back to Europe. As Müller boarded one bound for Bremerhaven, a guard handed him a small brown envelope. Inside were 2 photographs, one of the Texas plains and one of the camp choir singing beneath the stars. On the back, in English, someone had written, "Good luck, Carl. Remember, being decent doesn't end when the war does." He tucked it into his pocket and never forgot. When Carl Müller stepped off the ship in Bremerhaven in early 1946, the air smelled of ash and salt. Germany was no longer the empire he'd left behind. It was a graveyard of ideals. Cities lay in ruins, bridges shattered, rail lines twisted like broken bones. The once proud banners of the Reich had been reduced to scraps fluttering in the wind. Repatriated prisoners arrived by the thousands, wearing faded US Army-issued clothes marked POW. For many, the real shock wasn't what they'd endured in captivity, but what they found on their return. A homeland hollowed out by lies, families gone, neighborhoods vanished, children scavenging through rubble. Müller was reunited with his younger brother Hans, who had survived the war but carried the scars of hunger. Over a thin bowl of barley soup, Hans listened as Carl described his time in Texas, how the Americans had given them steak dinners, cigarettes, and books to read. Hans laughed bitterly. "Steak? While we boiled weeds for soup." Carl nodded slowly. "Yes, and they treated us like men." It was a confession that made no sense in post-war Germany. To admit respect for the enemy was dangerous, even shameful. But across the country, thousands of returning POWs carried similar stories, quiet, defiant memories of a decency that contradicted everything they had been taught. These former prisoners became, unintentionally, ambassadors of democracy. They spoke to neighbors, friends, and local officials about what they had seen in America. Some began teaching again, others took positions in the new civil administration. The seeds of West Germany's reconstruction, its values of fairness, law, and freedom, were often planted by men who had first learned them behind barbed wire. One US Army report from 1947 even noted, "The humane treatment of German POWs has proven to be among the most effective tools for reorientation and democratization." Carl kept his photograph of Camp Swift tucked in a small box for the rest of his life. When asked by his grandchildren what the war had taught him, he would always answer the same way. That decency can win a war more completely than hate ever will. In the decades that followed, historians and veterans alike would look back at the treatment of German prisoners in America as one of the quiet triumphs of the Second World War, a moral victory achieved without a single bullet fired. Between 1942 and 1946, nearly 500,000 German POWs had lived, worked, and reflected behind American fences. Most returned home not radicalized, but rehumanized. The US military hadn't planned it as a grand social experiment. The policy of humane treatment stemmed from the Geneva Convention and the hope that American prisoners held by Germany would be treated the same. Yet the results went far beyond reciprocity. The experience turned captured soldiers into witnesses of democracy, men who had seen compassion triumph where ideology had failed. In post-war interviews, many former POWs described their time in the United States as a revelation. "I learned freedom from my captors," said former Luftwaffe pilot Heinz Richter, "not from books, not from speeches, but from the way they lived." American communities, too, were changed by the experience. Farmers who had once grumbled about feeding Nazis steak later spoke fondly of the polite young men who helped save their harvests. Some even exchanged letters long after the war ended. Small towns in Texas, Georgia, and Wisconsin kept memories of those unlikely friendships alive for generations. By the 1950s, as the Cold War dawned, West Germany rose from the ashes with surprising speed, and its new democratic backbone owed something to those early lessons learned under guard towers. The idea that decency could defeat fanaticism, that generosity could dismantle hate, became a quiet cornerstone of transatlantic understanding. At Camp Swift, the barracks are gone now. Only a few concrete foundations remain, half swallowed by weeds and wind. But if you stand there at sunset, you can almost hear echoes of Stille Nacht blending with the hum of crickets, a memory of the night when enemies sang together and the world for a brief moment remembered its humanity. Karl Müller's story was only one among thousands, but his words in an old yellowed diary still speak for them all. They took away our weapons, but gave us something stronger. They showed us who we might have been if mercy, not hatred, had led our nation. And that perhaps was America's most unexpected victory of the war, winning hearts not through fear, but through fairness.